Welcome to Thinking Green. Well, it's become kind of a post-election tradition for Luther Weeks to join us and talk about both how things went in Connecticut this time around, what's coming up that we can do to help election integrity, and just generally about what we should be worrying about and what we shouldn't be worrying about in terms of our voting in the United States. So welcome, Luther.
Thank you.
And I guess maybe start out, I know you have, well, before I ask you to start, actually, I'm going to announce that New London viewers who are watching this might be interested in knowing that the recount of the Board of Education voting from Election Day will be taking place tomorrow at City Hall, starting at 10 a.m., and it was triggered by a small margin, 9 votes between 7th place placer Myrna Martinez and 8th place Kathy Skrabach. So if you're interested in coming to observe, I know I will be there. I know Myrna will be there. I assume Kathy and the Republican chair will be there, but it should be a really interesting experience. Okay, so now back to you, Luther. Can you start out and tell us a little bit about Connecticut Voters Count?
Well, sure. Well, we have Connecticut Voters Count, which is really a blog news site where we put information in there that's relevant to Connecticut voters. And that's Connecticut news. So you can look back in there 10 years and see what was going on 10 years ago in Connecticut elections. And
back before we got the new technology, I think 2009.
No, 2007 was the very year that we implemented optical scanners statewide.
Why was I thinking it was 2009?
I don't know. Anyway, yeah, and you can find national information that should be relevant to people in Connecticut interested in election integrity. But we also have the Connecticut Citizen Election Audit, which is nonpartisan, and we organize citizens to observe the post-election audits. That's where we take 5% of the voting machines in Connecticut and we count the ballots again to see how accurate the machines were in the election. So that's a plug, ctelectionaudit.org. You can volunteer right now to spend a day sometime starting next Wednesday for about 3 weeks after that. Spend one day observing that count that's called the audit. And
I notice, I can attest to the fact that it is really interesting, and you can choose how far away to drive. So I've been observing maybe for 5, 6, 7 years, I don't know, and have been to all the shoreline towns, it seems, and they're similar in some ways and different in some ways, and it is always very interesting.
Yeah.
But you mentioned when you were giving your description 5%. Didn't it used to be 10%?
Yeah, that's one of the, there were 2 blows to the audit last year. One of the blows was 10% was cut to 5%. And the other was we now, well, 2 years ago, the legislature authorized the Secretary of State to do electronic audits.
Oh.
And, you know, there's this term black box voting. That's where you put your ballot into this black box, and at the end the tape types out and it says who won.
And what
but
happened?
You don't know what the ballot's counted as. So that's like an audit, helps you catch that if that number comes out wrong. But if you put it into another machine and that machine says, oh, the first machine was right, that's what I call black box auditing. So there's a way of doing electronic auditing well, and there's a lot of ways of not doing it well and not transparently. So I was at the drawing today where the Secretary of State drew the districts for the drawing, and she was in a high school, and she lectured all the students how important it was to check the machines and how important transparency was. And then I talked to her assistant for elections, and they're going to do these electronic audits again, which are absolutely not transparent and impossible for citizens to determine their accuracy.
So does that mean we're not going to be watching people hand count
Well,
ballots this year?
we got 34 districts around the state selected for audit, and their goal would be to audit maybe 10 of them electronically. So we're going to have 24,
Wow.
maybe the reliable way and the transparent way, and we're going to maybe have 10 this new way that. Yeah, it's just, you know, I don't want to give you all the details because we'd be here for an hour explaining why it's not
Yeah.
transparent and how it could be.
And I think it's fairly obvious that, you know, you just put ballots into a different machine and you still are not as certain as actually checking your paper trail with your eyes.
Right, right, exactly.
So is there any plan to compare whether the two different types of audits came out with differing results?
No, because they audit different districts. And so, and let's say, and it's not true, I guess, but let's say there was some skullduggery involved and someone wanted to cover that up. Well, if they were to, they can control which way they do the audit, by hand or by that machine. Okay. So it's not like we're randomly selecting districts to be audited by machine and then separately randomly selecting them to be hand counted. There's, you know, humans make that choice.
That's an interesting difference. I wonder what the rationale was. Although I have to say I've spoken to our local registrars, and I don't know if it is a typical view, but our local registrars of voters have a lot of faith in the machines.
Right, that's rather strange. You know, I mean, most of us don't have, you know, are used to computers not always working. We're worried about Russians or anyone else hacking into our banking. In fact, our systems, our banks are being hacked all the time. Our federal government, the CIA, the NSA, they get hacked. And
I've
so
had
why would
something
we
like-
expect our local election officials and even the state of Connecticut to be able to protect things when the U.S. government and the most critical agencies that are supposed to be in charge of cybersecurity can't help being hacked? You know, and basically you cannot trust machines unless you have a way of auditing them. And, you know, so, but people like to, you know, there's a famous quote, and I never remember it, you know, you can't, it's very hard to convince somebody of something that's going to take their job away from them. So, I mean, the other side is if you got a job you don't like auditing by hand, it's going to be very hard to convince you that some magical way of doing it that relieves you of all the work isn't something that you can trust.
Well, it's really been interesting for me to observe from the start that individuals, the people who are most concerned that there could be ways of hacking, there could be ways that our electronic scanning system could have problems, are the people who are generally most in love with technology, most knowledgeable about technology.
Yeah.
And it's the people who are, Luddite might be too strong a term, but people who don't use technology so much have a little more faith. And that doesn't make sense. I mean,
yeah, well, my understanding, I recently learned this. Luddites were people that were afraid of some kind of automation, and they were union members that wanted to protect their jobs. So it wasn't that they resisted technology, like not trusting it. They wanted to protect their jobs. Okay, you know, it's no stranger than environmental scientists warning about global warming or the dangers of, you know, burning fossil fuels. Okay, computer scientists, what they understand computers. So if there's dangers in computers, who else would know?
Yeah.
Or would know first?
So, can you talk a little bit about the purpose of the audit and why this new method might not help us learn as much as how we did it in the past?
Sure. So, yeah, the purpose of the audit, and I wish it was to verify the election results. but it's actually to verify the machines counted accurately.
And I think actually some towns that I've observed, the people involved in the audit don't understand that.
Absolutely. There's a lot that people, well, just people assume things, and they don't, there's no evil intent or anything like that.
No, not at
But there's a
all.
lot of things that people misunderstand. I was in a Recanvass. We were talking about Recanvasses,
Right.
and I've heard this in audits. Oh, the machine processed the ballot, so it counted it right. No. All that the machine processes a ballot, if it worked properly, the machine, all it says is it recognized one vote on there. So they assume that a machine processes the ballot, that it read everything on it fine. And
Right.
they don't. We know that. But
Right.
because it depends how well the machine's working, usually well, but it also depends on how the voter filled out the ballot, whether it's going to read on it everything that you would want to if you're judging by voter intent.
Right, and in a Recanvass, it kind of makes sense that if I recall from some of the past ones I've observed, you do, the ballots are looked at to see if there are some places where voter intent was clear, but the machine might not have picked it up correctly.
Exactly.
Which is not really what the audit is looking for, because if the circle is way around the whole box, the machine isn't supposed to be programmed to pick that up.
Exactly. The audit is there to see if the machine's counted properly, and sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. And when they don't count properly, most of the time it's some human error, but the fact is, if the tape is wrong, then you want to detect that, whether it was caused by a person or it was a bad machine,
Right.
or if maybe it was skullduggery. You want to know what it is, and you want to figure out how to resolve that in the future, or maybe in the particular election you're involved in.
I know when I don't know, I guess I should ask you if you see a problem with this. With the new machines they use for people with disabilities, the cards that are used for testing our scanners in New London, they print out using those machines. So they have the nice dark rectangle that covers the bubble. Is that a proper test, or should they be using?
Well, last year, the first time we used that machine, there were 2 problems with testing. And this year, there's only 1.
Okay.
So, you pointed out, actually the problem you pointed to is gone. So
Okay.
last year, let's say a bubble is this big. It's obviously smaller than that.
Right.
But last year, it printed a square this big.
Right.
And so if it printed the square in the right place, obviously it would count the vote right because you've covered a big thing, so it was fine. But they used that to test our optical scanners, and the problem is if you're testing any place in that area, if somebody programmed where this bubble was, and that's actually what they do, they program where the bubble is.
Right.
So if they program it in the wrong place, then maybe that person will lose a lot of votes because maybe the way the actual bubble gets filled in and the machine doesn't detect them all. And the test would not detect that because you got this big block. Now, that's actually changed this year. So if you voted on that machine for the person with disabilities, you would see that it actually fills in just the bubble now. Maybe just a little bit bigger.
So,
but
it's already not the whole big
right. It's very
corner.
close to the size of the bubble. It might be just a little bit more. So that's largely solved. But that leaves another problem. So what that machine does is you push a button and it does a test and it puts out these 25 ballots.
Right.
But that doesn't test the machine for the person with disabilities. That doesn't test if they vote for Smith up here.
Right.
It actually covers the Smith vote on the ballot. It might do the Jones vote. Okay? So it's a good test of the scanner, but now it's still not a good test. The way to test the machine for the person with disabilities is sit down and vote with it on a touch screen, but it also votes by a headset and a keyboard.
And
so
then-
you should test it. You know, maybe you can't do as many,
Right.
you know, as you do for an optical scanner, but you should just test at least a few with both the headset and the touch screen, but it's just not a test of that machine. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it may not be too serious because, for instance, in my town in 2016, I understand there was only one voter that used that machine, and we have about, you know, they have about 20,000 voters. And the voter that used that machine, you're actually looking at him.
Oh.
No person with disability came in, but I wanted to use it. So I went ahead and used it.
And it worked well for you?
It worked well, except I was shocked to see the big squares because then all of a sudden I said, well, my vote is not secret to the people in this polling place. If we ever had a Recanvass or an audit,
Everyone
the
would
people
know.
in the polling place would know that that ballot's mine. Okay, so, that was interesting.
That is
It
interesting.
is, and I'll say it's interesting because sometimes when you belong to a political party and you're on the town committee, sometimes you don't always vote for all your own candidates in your party.
Right.
And sometimes it's a good idea for people not to know that.
Yeah. Well,
It's a good idea for you if people don't know that.
yeah, I know the feeling. Not that of course for Democrats in New London that could be a real problem because the Democrats usually do run, a full slate. And we Greens, we only run a few candidates, so we expect people to vote around the ballot.
Sure.
Or people could say, "Oh, you bullet voted. That's bad."
Right.
So and really, it is our right to be able to vote confidentially, right?
Well, it's more than that. I'm working on some documents now. There's a lot of things going on a national level. And I was reading one today, and it said the secret vote, you have to maintain the secret vote so the voter can be protected from their ballot, how they voted being.
Right.
Well, actually, the secret ballot protects us that nobody's vote is going to be able to be public, that that you can't prove to somebody how you voted,
Right.
so they can't pay you for voting a particular way, or they can't intimidate
Right.
you to vote in a particular way. For instance, your boss might say, well, if you want to come to work tomorrow, you better vote a certain way. And if I found out you voted the other way, well, I think I'm going to have a downsizing. And,
Right, and you might get downsized.
Yeah, you might be a downsize out, or, you wouldn't want, somebody might not want their religious community to know that, their feelings about, let's say, choice or something.
Right. So it does protect all of us that our votes are, except for yours this year
Right.
in Glastonbury,
Last year, yeah.
are confidential.
Right.
So, so how much paper do we have to count to feel confident that the machines are working?
Depends on how you do it. If you do it in, if we should count a lot. We should probably count that 10%. There's some of the paper that we don't count that's not eligible to be counted in our audit. So, maybe we ought to count more. And but there's other ways of auditing that we can really be confident in our whole election. Okay, and they're piloting that thing, or they're actually doing it by law in Colorado for the first time. Actually, starting later this week, in something called a risk limiting audit.
Now, you had mentioned that Rhode Island was going that
Rhode Island
direction
just passed the law this year, and in fact, they had the Senate come back into session for a bunch of things, and because they didn't get to this law, they passed it. And everybody in Rhode Island was in favor of it. And the reason why, Rhode Island's never had an audit before, but last year they had a machine misprogrammed, and it caused the wrong candidate to originally be declared the winner, but then they found the machine was misprogrammed, and I think it was several machines. I'm not.
Yeah.
So, but in a way, that turned out to be a good thing because they found it, but then they said, we got to audit. They've never audited before, and they said, we're going to go towards the state-of-the-art auditing. So they're going to you know, I think they only have elections every other year in Rhode Island, something like that. So they're in 2018, it's kind of optional, and they're going to kind of play with it. But I think by 2020, they got to have they've got to have regulations in place that what they're going to do exactly. So Connecticut's not in a good position to do risk limiting audits.
Now, what's
Many
the
states
difference
are.
between risk limiting audits and what we do?
Well, so we sort of have an audit that's supposed to check the machine. So it's sort of a way, like if you want to cut down speeding on Main Street, okay? You actually don't have to arrest everybody.
Right.
All you have to do, go out there for a couple hours a week, and if you arrest every person that goes 2 miles an hour over the speed limit, after a couple weeks, you're going to have very, very little speeding out there on Main Street. So that's kind of the audit we got. If our machines aren't quite working right, we'll find out, we'll correct it, but we won't stop all speeding. You know,
Right.
somebody's going to get away with it. A risk limiting audit is to have a predefined risk that if election was decided the wrong way, that it wouldn't be detected. It's kind of a hard way to say it, but it's sort of like if there's, if somebody's speeding between midnight and 6 a.m. on Main Street, you're going to catch 95% of the people that are speeding. Okay. Well, that doesn't mean that 5% of our elections are going to
Right.
are decided wrong. It means that, let's say that 1 out of 100, 1 out of 1,000 races is detected wrong. Well, we're going to catch 95% of those that are decided wrong. So that's a risk limiting audit. The problem is that you need a different kind of voting equipment. You have to have a different approach than we use to auditing. So, what I'm hoping is they do a good job in Colorado, and we do a good job in Rhode Island over time. We may even have a law in Georgia on this. Georgia, probably the most notorious state in the country for not having, touch screens and no records and some shoddy things going on. They may have paper and risk limiting audits soon. They've got a bill in the Georgia legislature to do that. So maybe Connecticut gets new voting machines over the next 5 to 10 years. We'll get the right kind. We'll set things up, and we'll be doing risk limited audits like the rest of the world.
Now, you mentioned briefly like Russian hackers, but and you seem like that isn't something that's on the top of your list of worries in terms of our elections. What are the real dangers that you see in our elections, and what are things that you see as not quite as
Well,
important?
I think, hacking is a danger. Hacking is a danger, but I think we're kind of in a little bit of a McCarthy era as far as the Russians goes right now. Both in the things with Facebook and Google and the things, with their alleged hacking. They started out saying they hacked 21 state voter registration databases. Well, it may be that they did a little bit of something with 2 of them, but then all of a sudden, 3 out of that 21 disappeared because they were wrong in their analysis. Okay? And none of those were hacking. Those are, as far as I know, it's more like standard things that China and people in T-shirts in their, in their bedroom are doing all day long to everything. So I think it's being kind of blown out of proportion. But the other side of that doesn't mean that somebody couldn't hack into our machines. Whether it's Russia, whether it's China, whether it's that guy in a T-shirt, and whether it's the NSA or some actor inside the U.S. government could do it just as well. And it's not just hacking, it's insiders, election officials, and that's happened from time to time. So that's one big worry. That's why we need paper ballots. That's why we need things like audits and recanvasses. That's what we need, and we need those everywhere. We need them in every state in the country.
Now, we're seeing a lot of cries for like more stringent ID requirements for people to vote. And at the same time, we have a big problem, in my opinion, with certain groups of people being disenfranchised.
Yeah.
So what is the right balance point, I guess, with including everyone who really is qualified to vote, balanced with being secure?
Well, I think it's the relative to the danger. So, I mean, Connecticut has this kind of a middle ground, okay? Where, most people bring a driver's license, and that's the easiest way to vote in Connecticut, but you can bring utility bills, you can bring a lot of stuff in, and you can even sign an affidavit that,
Right.
you're who you say you are, and you forgot in most cases. There's some federal rules
Right.
that are exceptions to that. So I think that's a nice balance. But until somebody shows that there's a significant amount of voter fraud, then, it's sort of like that speeding on Main Street. You might want to go out there and send a policeman out there and check about speeding of people going through the stop signs. But, if you did that 3 hours a day for 6 months and then you found out you aren't even arresting people, while you're undercover and all that, then maybe you can cut it down and only go out there once a week. And, and that's where we are. They've tried to do some witch hunts for voter fraud, and they don't find any, because our problem is getting people to the polls, getting people interested in voting. And I'll just say the immigrant would be the last person. I mean, the immigrants that I understand, the illegal ones, want to stay under the radar. So
Yeah,
the
they're
last
not gonna turn up
yeah,
at the
I don't even
polls.
think they probably don't even follow things well enough to have anything in the game to vote. And why would they risk it? Why would they risk anything to go do it? And why would an average citizen, in their right mind, with the penalties for voting 2-3 times? I mean,
There are
the
a couple
penalties
people-
are huge. The penalties are huge.
Yeah, there
Yeah.
are a couple people who are listed in the Connecticut database twice or more,
Right.
due to if they moved and they used a middle initial in one time and not the other, or it might not have been caught that they were the same person.
And I would, but that's because of the gargantuan laws that we have. That we don't have a national ID card. Now what's interesting is all the hackers and Facebook and the banks, they all know where you live.
they do.
Your phone company, everybody knows where you are and who you are, except the government isn't allowed to know who you are and where you are, except these arcane, methods where you register for a driver's license, and you may even get registered to vote, but they're separate databases pretty quick. And you leave the state, and it's very hard for officials to keep that data up to date. But just because all these people are in the voter rolls doesn't mean they vote. I mean, show me the people that are dead that are voting, other than an occasional mistake where somebody crosses off the wrong person on the list, or the son comes in with the same name as the father who's deceased, but the son thinks he's registered and he's not. That does happen, but.
That isn't going to turn
I
the
can't get
tide.
excited about somebody that could have been registered, who thinks they're registered and happens to vote under their father's name. I mean, that's technically a crime, but it's like I can't get excited about it because the person thought they were registered and they could have been registered. So where's the real crime?
And on the other exclusionary piece of it, I became aware when my mom lived with me for about 4 or 5 years. She moved here at age 86. And, the first time you vote, they do really want to check your ID well.
Right.
And she could not get ID. She always voted absentee ballots, but I have a feeling they didn't get counted because moving from another state, she had a non-driver's ID, but they're not valid for as long as driver's licenses. And her passport was expired, and she was in a nursing home with a broken arm at the time that the ID was supposed to be renewed, and Connecticut wouldn't take expired expired identification, and they never really, we actually almost couldn't open a bank account for her. It
Yeah.
was really crazy. And I do wonder how many elderly people, not if they've stayed in the same place their whole life, but if they moved to a different state to be near their kids,
Yeah.
how many of them can never really sign up to vote in the new place.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
at least in national elections, a lot of these folks are very
Yeah,
engaged.
I don't know. I haven't heard a lot of stories of that in Connecticut where people were disenfranchised. I mean, I did have to turn a couple people away in November 16 because they didn't have ID, but it was because they left at home and they were initial vote in a federal election.
Right.
And then when it's a guy in a wheelchair and his son is pushing him in
Oh,
there, that's one of the hardest things you got to do, is to explain that to the person that they can't vote because of that.
Wow.
Yep.
Now, was this the first year that the election day registration carried over, not just for the presidential race, but for all the local races?
No,
or has
it's
that been going on
since
for-
2013.
How is that going?
Only in November elections. Since 2013, there's been election day registration.
So how is that working? I know that there were controversies when it started, if people were in line at 8 o'clock, or they had registered but hadn't voted or hadn't registered yet.
Well, yeah,
Are we
that's
seeing-
not working well. Okay, this is the nightmare that I and some other people predicted is, when you get to a polling place at 8 p.m. and you're in line at 8 p.m., you get to vote.
Right.
If you get to the election day registration site, you have to be registered by 8 p.m. to be able to vote. So if you get there at 7:30 and there's a long line, you may not get the vote. And what I warn people of is it's actually worse than that. Some people say, oh, we're lucky we have election day registration. The most stringent in any state, the hardest in any state that has election day registration by far. But so if we screw up our registration database and you think you're registered and
Right.
you aren't, through no fault of your own, or even if it is your fault, you can always go to the election day registration, and
Right.
that's a lie.
Oh.
You can only go there if you get to your polling place in time, that by the time they figure out, you get done with the line there or whatever, and they're figuring out whether you're registered or not until you should do EDR, well, then you got to go to EDR, which is in a different place in your town. Now, if you're
Yeah.
driving, it might be easy. In my town, it still can take 20 minutes of driving if you get the directions right. And then you might get there and you're going to be in line again. So you got to get to your polling place. You can't get to your polling place at 7:30 and have any hope that you're going to get EDR done. And we've left, in 2016, we left hundreds of people in all of our big cities and some other places standing in line unable to vote. And all these people wanted to vote. They got to their polling place in time, but they ended up at EDR in a long, long line. They have a word for that, and that's a civil rights violation,
So,
in my opinion.
So how do we change that?
Well, the legislature is finally onto it. 2 years ago, they finally got it, but they haven't passed a law to fix it. And our registrars want to fix it by saying you got to close down EDR at 7 p.m., even earlier. Yeah, well, the legislature wants to fix it to say, well, some people in the legislature want to fix it. Obviously, they all don't want to fix it enough to have passed the bill,
Yeah,
but they
it's
want
not
to
a
say
big-
if you're in line by 8 p.m., you're okay. That's sort of good. You still got to get to your polling place probably by 7:15.
Right.
It's a help. We're not going to disenfranchise hundreds of people standing in line at 8 o'clock, okay? But we got to go beyond that. We got to do what the other states do. You can do EDR in any polling place. You just go into the right polling place and you can do EDR right there. And you're going to get a $10,000 fine if you vote twice. So not many
Yeah.
people are going to vote twice.
But now, for the most part, people have to go to their town halls for
Right,
EDR.
the town hall, yeah.
And
And it's nowhere near as much of a problem in a municipal election because somehow we don't get many people motivated enough to vote in those.
now I think Bob this year was driving someone who had to go from place to place before he finally got to vote. And
Yeah.
and fortunately, they were doing it at like 1 in the afternoon, so it was okay.
Yeah. Well, sometimes, polling places change, people's memories change. I always voted here. Well, maybe you did, maybe you didn't, but we know it changed 4 years ago, so it's been a while since you voted. And then we can screw up. It's very hard sometimes if somebody's in the wrong polling place. In my town, you've got streets. We have streets that go to 3 different polling places on it. These are long streets. And then you have some parts of the street, everybody goes here, some parts, everybody goes there. And then this part, the odds go here and the evens go there. So it can be difficult for election officials sometimes not to give somebody and say, I hate it when somebody shows up at my polling place and they say, this is the 3rd place I've been.
Well, and New London has that a little bit too. Its downtown area is just sort of a funny curve.
Must be why you must have put an ocean nearby.
Yeah, I don't. When they merged districts, the old 7th district was merged into the 2nd, and the old 3rd district was merged into the 1st. And it used to be that the discrepancy was people didn't know if they were in the 3rd or the 7th because you live half a block from someone right downtown.
I don't think John Winthrop really meant that, did he?
I don't think so. For some reason, that old 7th district was a very weird, up the coast and curling around the downtown, and we're still living with some of the confusion from it. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about specific issues in this year's election, and I didn't hear it on the news, but when I looked at your blog, something odd happened in Danbury. So what happened in Danbury?
Well, first is kind of a sad thing, I guess, that one of the selectmen, longtime incumbent, died over the weekend before the election, died suddenly, and he was on the ballot. And the law in Connecticut is very clear. And I would guess that, along with myself, that 98% of the people in Connecticut, 99% probably had no idea what the law was.
I sure don't.
But people could figure it out very quickly after that happened. But the law is real simple. If you die within 24 hours before an election, or a candidate does, they stay on the ballot, and the town chair can appoint a replacement, just like as if they got elected and died 2 days later. But if they die more than 24 hours before, one of 2 things happens. One is by 2 p.m. the day before the election, the town chair comes and says, this other person is going to run for that office. And the registrars of voters have to put stickers on the ballot that's, I don't know, just stickers that say, Jane Smith instead of Harry Jones.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if the town chair doesn't come there by 2 p.m. and do that, then they just sticker it over, and there's the deceased candidate's not on the ballot anymore. So what happened in Danbury, as I understand it from all the news reports and everything, is the town chair did not show up by 2 p.m., but the registrar said, we're going to leave.
We're not going to do this extra work.
Right. Well, they also, but I mean, this was clear before 2 p.m. that they weren't going to show up, and the registrars were going to leave it on the ballot, and then the Republican chair was going to appoint somebody the next day. Well, the Secretary of State warned them this is illegal, and you can't do this. The law is clear. You got to. And by the way, you get a bunch of stickers in the ballot clerks and put the sticker. You don't have to go sticker, 20,000 ballots the night before. You could deliver them to the polling place or do a few for each polling place, and then give the instructions out, and maybe you're going to get a couple people to go around and help a little bit, but it doesn't take much to sticker these ballots. Anyway, but that's the law. Whether it takes a lot or a little, that's the law. So it looked like it was going to be a big, big problem. But fortunately, I guess all the news about this got around enough that the voters solved the problem, because not that many of them voted for the deceased candidate.
Just as well.
So what happened is that, who would have been harmed was the Democratic Party. If they had gone forward and done it, And, you know, if the candidate won, it would be crazy. Could be crazy because what do you do even if you say all those votes for that candidate are null and void? What do you do with, you know, who won? Who then won? What happened is, I guess he lost. And so that meant that maybe, you know, if it was done correctly, it might be that some other Democratic candidate would have won versus another one, but there's no real reason, I guess, to go to court about it. And, you know, that's a pretty bad situation. It's pretty bad. And, you know, it's pretty hard to remedy very well because even another election, it's done on another day. It's not. That's why courts are hesitant to ever award another, you know, rerun of an election because it's a different day, and different people are going to show up, especially if it's Now this is the town council. That's probably an easy rerun in the sense that most of the same voters will come out. Right. But if it was the dog catcher or the, you know, it wouldn't be the same election by any means. But I would hope. That someone issue an election enforcement complaint against the registrars and they get fined. That would be my take. That somebody ought to do that because that's just like blatant, you know, chosen defiance of the law. And they knew what the law is. They were told very clearly what the law is.
Now, so the New London viewers will know that. You know, tomorrow we have our recount, Recanvass, due to the close election. So citizens can come and observe the recount. So what should we all be looking for as we're seeing the ballots being, you know, fed through the machines largely, but probably also looked at to see how people voted?
So first of all, you know, there's two classes of citizens, and some can't go see it. Really, they can go stand in the corner and watch from across the room. And some classes of citizens, a few that are representing the candidates of the parties, they can observe closely what's going on. So as an average citizen that's watching this that isn't representing a candidate or a party, now they can sit on the side, and they can probably pretty well tell whether the candidates and the parties are doing what they ought to be doing, or what I think they ought to be doing. What they're supposed to do is to take each ballot out and look at it and see if they think a machine would have counted that correctly or not. And you should actually, and the other thing is, two people of opposing interests should be looking at every one of those ballots. So this is the most often thing that's not done correctly, in my opinion. So somehow they don't train people, or sometimes you have to, when you're doing something like this, you not only have to train people, you have to see that they're doing it and see that they're continually doing it. Okay, it's worse than going to driver education and say obey the speed limit. And you know how well that works. But most people know that they actually heard that. Okay. But so you as an observer should see that if there's, let's say, 3 tables of people with piles of ballots, that there's actually a person looking at it and another. They could both look at it together, and, you know, or one of them could look at it and once in a while they'll pull one out, and then the other one could look at the same pile and go through it separately. Either way, as long as 2 different people look at it, and in their judgment, the machine might not have counted it right. The other problem that happens with that is, what does that mean, the machine might not have counted it right? So they should overdo it. Those people should overdo it initially. And maybe some, like the head moderators in charge, can review those and might decide, well, this can obviously be counted. But, you know, you want to have a ballot that most of the bubbles are mostly filled in. That's a starter. But if there's, you know, some bubble that hasn't got, you know, a third filled in or something like that, okay, then it ought to be counted by hand. If there's anything like a cross out on it, or somebody wrote something on there, or obviously, like we've talked about, they do a big circle, or they're doing checks, and, you know, and you got to look at it very closely. Did 10 checks on there are really good, and there's 11th check on there someplace, but it kind of missed the oval. But all the
Yeah.
rest of them did, and you kind of gotta, you kind of gotta look at it. And that's a small number usually that you get in that, but you gotta look at them, and that's what you should look at. That they're actually doing that, that they put them in there. Another very important aspect is, do they do the hand count in a way that really counts them right? So a lot of these people, they aren't used to doing a hand count. And they don't do it in an organized way. So you kind of got to watch what they do. You know, I mean, they might do it wrong. I mean, I just screw up. But probably it's not like, you know, when you're you get mesmerized in these audits sometimes when they're counting 1,000 ballots or 3,000 ballots. You know, you kind of get used to Smith. Well, one of those Smiths was a Jones, but you just said Smith because, or the other person is going too fast and they're making check marks, and you know the other person says Jones, but they still check Smith, and you're going to do a smaller number of ballots. But it's still that, are they doing it right? You know, I've seen just they do ad hoc things, so you want to check that out.
Now, I have a question, a conceptual question, because I've noticed in the past when I've observed audits that there are two people of different interests at each table, teams usually. Okay, so in New London, in this election, one of the candidates, you know, two candidates with the small gap between them, one is Green Party, one is a Republican. So if you have people at the table, one a Democrat, one a Republican, they might actually have the same interest.
Yeah.
And it might not be our green interest.
Right. So you ought to be watching.
So we got to be watching.
Yeah, and
But
you know, on
is
the
there any
other hand, as
precedent for
a member of the Green Party,
Yeah.
before every election, do you propose election officials to your registrars and ask for could we have at least one Green Party official in each polling place, so that then we do
That's a
when
good
we do the
idea.
recanvass, because the officials doing the recanvass are the same people that worked on election day, and that's the law. Okay.
You know what? That
Yeah.
okay. That's something that we have to work on.
Right. Right.
You know, it's not easy being small and new.
Right. Now, there's a question of the league, you know, whether they have to meet your requirements, but they should. I mean,
Yeah.
you can't claim that you want to have a third of the moderators,
Right.
for example, if you
Right.
got, or something like that. But, you ought to be able to get somebody in there. If you have people who go to, maybe you should have
Yeah.
3 assistant registrars if they can, if they can afford that. But at least you should have an official there.
Yeah,
somewhere.
and of course, we don't have any chance of ever having a green registrar because New London, I don't know if we're unique,
Oh,
but
you're
we're
appointed.
unusual. We have appointed registrars,
Well,
not elected
Well,
registrars.
but you could take control of the town council. You could do a charter revision. You could have registrars.
The last charter revision actually had some interesting things in it. District representation and staggered terms. One of the things that happened this year in New London with the Board of Ed race is, there was huge turnover because everyone has a 2-year term and it could turn over 100%. And one thing the last group that was proposing revisions was to have 4-year terms that were staggered.
Yeah.
So that you always were guaranteed of having some institutional knowledge.
Right.
And one of the reasons that it was such a big year for Board of Ed elections more than City Council was that we knew there would be a large turnover. And, a lot of the new candidates were really good candidates, but you don't want 7 people who are all on the learning curve all at the same time.
Right.
So that is kind of an issue. Okay, so, gosh, we only have not even 5 minutes. So talk about the audit and how people can sign up.
Sure. So what you do is go to ctelectionaudit.org, and conveniently, right on the top of that is the information about being an audit observer. and the sign up, and what it involves. Now, what it is we don't know where those audits are going to be right now. There's going to be 34 districts in the state audited, and the registrars in those particular towns that got selected for audit set the date and time. So we have to figure out when that is over about a 3-week period. So what we have people do, like, thank you for
Yes, I
registering
signed
nice
up.
and early. But you sign up and you
I
say,
didn't dare not be
I
signed
could
up
be-
when you came on.
right. So let's say you say, I can do Thursday and Friday this week, and Wednesday and Thursday that next week, or whatever days you can do. And then you say that you're willing to drive 35 miles from your house, or 50 miles from your house, or anywhere in the state. And then what I do is, when there's an audit, say there's one in Mystic, there actually is going to be probably, then I'll look and I'll say, who's near Mystic? And I have this all programmed in my system.
Sure.
It'll tell me everybody that's available on that day and how far away they live from Mystic. And so then, how far they're willing to travel. So I will match you up with Mystic. Now, if it's your first time doing it, then I'll guarantee you that I'm going to schedule an expert observer to be with you, not yourself. You may go alone, or you may have an opportunity to help train. And we have conference call training, 4 different times, any one of those you can do. We also have video training. So when you sign up, I send you an email, and it tells you the conference call codes, and it also gives you access to the video training. And the video training takes just a little bit over an hour. And then, we have forms for you to fill out and that kind of stuff. It's fascinating. But there is an addictive nature to it, because we had about 6 or 8 of our observers that later on, because they did observing, they became registrars of voters.
And they're probably good registrars.
They are.
Well, we're out of time, I'm afraid, but I thank you so much for coming down to New London again. ctvoterscount.org and Connecticut ctelectionaudit.org are the 2 websites that you can visit to get information about both observing and just what's going on in the election world. So next week, our guest will be Mark Bronstein, and he's going to talk about addiction, prostitution, public health, and the law. So it will be quite a different show. So good night to everyone, and thank you, Luther.
Thank you.
Vamos